Let me first thank the organizers, Professor Azadegan, and especially Abu Taleb, who I've been communicating with concerning this conference, this summer school. And I'm sorry I can't be there, but it's great to participate, even if remotely. I'm going to put up a PowerPoint and hope you can follow along with this. My title is A Meshed Architecture in Performance and Social Cognition. And I will give you an outline that I will follow. And I'm going to start by looking at this concept of a meshed architecture. This has been developed as a model of performance by Christensen, Sutton, and McElwain in a 2016 paper. A model of performance that tries to integrate cognitive and embodied motoric processes. Performance meaning such cases as athletics, but also performing arts, the performance of music, and such. I want to also suggest that we can develop a more enhanced meshed architecture, a more enhanced concept that in fact is more embodied and situated than the one presented by Christensen and colleagues. And then what I want to do is I want to take this model that has been developed in performance studies and apply it to the case of social cognition, thinking about social cognition as itself a kind of performance rather than a narrow type of mind reading or theory of mind approach, thinking of it as a much more embodied and situated and interactive kind of performance. And I'll take a conversation between two people as an example, and then see if we can apply and make good use of the meshed architecture model. The model of meshed architecture was actually developed in opposition to proposals made by Hubert Dreyfus about expert performance. You may be familiar with Dreyfus's work. He very much emphasized embodied coping and the performer being in the flow. And when the performer is in the flow, it's a kind of mindless experience, according to Dreyfus. Mindless in the sense that no thinking, no reflection, nothing interrupts the flow. It sort of takes care of itself, and it's very much an embodied type of process. In contrast to such a proposal, a number of other theorists, not just Christensen and Sutton, but others like Montero and Schusterman, have argued that performance, in fact, does involve mindful cognitive elements, and they conceive of a top-down process where lower order processes of embodied coping are actually modulated by the higher order reflective cognitive aspects. So they think that reflection can enter into performance without disrupting it, quite in contrast to someone like Dreyfus. So one such theorist is Barbara Montero, who was a trained dancer and also a philosopher. And in her studies of dance performance, she argues that optimal performance often coincides with reflective, thoughtful performance. And when she says thoughtful performance, she means, as she describes, self-reflective thinking, planning, predicting, deliberation, attention to or monitoring of, or even conceptualizing of actions and control, having a sense of the self and acting for a reason, even within the performance. Another theorist, Robert Cohen, in the context of theatrical performance, also refers to a kind of thinking that goes on, a preparatory thinking, as the actor readies herself for the role, but also an in-performance thinking, which he says in an ideal situation is aligned with the performer's action. In addition, someone like Richard Schusterman, looking at a number of different types of performance, describes an explicit reflective consciousness that monitors the performance and also is self-consciously monitoring the performance. So a lot of the theorists here are suggesting that there's a lot of thinking going on, a lot of reflective, higher order type thinking happening during performance. And John Sutton is part of this group who develops the meshed architecture idea. And I think he has a good general description of what's at stake here. He says, skill is not a matter of bypassing explicit thought to let habitual actions run entirely on their own, but of building and accessing flexible links between knowing and doing. The forms of thinking and remembering, which can in some circumstances reach in to animate the subtle kinesthetic mechanisms of skilled performance, must themselves be redescribed as active and dynamic. So these thoughtful processes are reaching into the motoric kinesthetic processes and guiding them in some way during performance. And this has then given us a model of the meshed architecture. It's proposed to explain how precisely these mindful processes reach in to the motoric processes during performance. So Christensen and colleagues, including John Sutton, put it this way. They call it a hybrid view, according to which cognitive control reduces during skilled learning as automatic control comes to play an increasing role, but cognitive control continues to make a substantial positive contribution even at advanced levels of skill. So even if you are the expert, you're still using certain cognitive abilities in order to control your performance. The notion of the mesh, this meshing or integration, involves, they say, a broadly hierarchical division of control responsibilities, with cognitive control usually focused on strategic aspects of performance and automatic processes more concerned with implementation. And they describe what they call a situated awareness. This comes in performance as being aware of what one is doing, but also using that awareness as a mode of control for your action. So again, they describe it in this way: controlled and automatic processes are closely integrated in skilled action, and cognitive control directly influences motor execution in many ways. So at the top of the mesh, you have these cognitive processes. At the bottom, you have automatic processes. Now, it turns out that different interpretations of this meshed architecture are possible. depending on how we understand, first of all, the cognitive elements. Is it a matter of explicit thinking and remembering? Is it more like a heedful attending, or even a pre-reflective awareness? So how we conceive of those cognitive elements is one question. Another question has to do with how to conceive of the motoric components. Christensen, Sutton, and McElwain think that they are automatic, but it's possible that there are models in which they are not so automatic. So what I want to do is start with their conception of a meshed architecture and try to enhance it, develop it a bit further to make it a bit more embodied, and we'll see how this goes. There are, in fact, 4 different parts of my proposal to enhance the mesh. The first one is to think a little bit more about the cognitive elements and to suggest that perhaps it's more complex, that there's a more complex conception of the cognitive aspects that we can appeal to. From higher order thought, perhaps sometimes, but also perhaps pre-reflective awareness is involved. And the second, the concept of an intrinsic control. I want to say that control is not entirely top-down, driven by cognitive processes, but rather on a kind of vertical axis. There are, I think, important bottom-up processes that are not automatic. And 3, I want to introduce the notion of a horizontal axis that integrates environmental, social, cultural, normative type factors into the performance itself. And finally, I want to highlight affective processes. I think that affective processes modulate the dynamics of the integration on both the vertical and the horizontal axes. So I'm going to say a little bit about each of these in turn, and then we'll take this model and see if we can apply it to social cognition. So the first point about complex cognition, when you read the literature on performance, what you find are various descriptions of thoughtful, heedful processes that could involve some very high-order self-reflective thinking, planning, predicting, deliberation. John Sutton also talks about a kind of selective target control in the process of performing, especially with respect to sports performance. People also talk about a conscious monitoring of their body and of the situation. One description has it that it involves a sense of one's rightly configured body. And finally, there are a number of phenomenologists who argue that really we're talking about a pre-reflective awareness, maybe an enhanced pre-reflective awareness that is proprioceptive, a performative or a kind of pragmatic awareness, a kind of know-how, an awareness that goes along with know-how. Well, regardless of how these mindful processes are conceptualized, they need to be integrated in some fashion with motor control processes in performance. And that's what the model of the meshed architecture is supposed to give us. Let's take a look, however. The second point has to do with the automaticity, about those motor processes that are supposedly automatic. So I think this is a central question. Are the motor control body schematic processes fully automatic? Well, if we think that automatic means consistently the same or repetitive, unchanging, unadapting, then I think the answer is no. These body schematic processes are not automatic in that sense. Now, this goes against a very intellectualistic interpretation of know-how. For example, one developed by Jason Stanley and in his papers with Williamson talks about know-how and skill as really a form of thinking, a form of knowing that, plus motor control, where motor control is entirely automatic, and as Stanley puts it, perfectly general. That's the concept of automaticity that I would want to challenge here. I think there's a lot of evidence that motor control is not automatic and perfectly general, but in fact is highly specific and modulated by task and environment, and relates directly to the intentions of the agent involved. Now, I've developed a lot of the detailed argumentation here, citing a lot of evidence in a recent paper in 2020, if you want to find that. Here, I just will talk a little bit about habit. Habitual movement or behavior is not blind or repetitive or always the same. Adjustments are made relative to the task, relative to the environment, bodily position in the environment, and also the agent's intention in action. All of these aspects enter in, and one gets a kind of adaptation happening within the habit itself. This notion of habit, I think, goes along quite well with Merleau-Ponty in his thinking, where he proposed a concept of intelligent habit, which is not automatic or repetitive, although it may be close to automatic or automatic in some respects. The important part here is that intelligence is built into the movement so that control is intrinsic. As Merleau-Ponty puts it, the body acquires the power of responding with a certain type of solution to a certain form of situation, and it will adapt to different situations. This concept of habit that you find in Merleau-Ponty can also be found in the American pragmatist John Dewey. Instead of blind automatic repetition, habit is an open and adaptive way in which the body learns to cope with familiar or unfamiliar situations. As Dewey puts it, repetition is in no sense the essence of habit. The essence of habit is an acquired predisposition to ways or modes of response. And again, responding to different situations. In other words, you can't simply do the same thing in every situation. That would be like a kind of reflex. But in performance, you simply can't do that. You have to be attuned to the situation in such a way that you're going to be able to adapt to changes and to differences in environment and so forth. The third point has to do with the role of affect. Affect, I think, shapes our ability to cope with the surrounding world. And it works differently in different types of skilled actions. Affective processes directly shape body schematic motor control processes. For example, slowing down or speeding up such processes, or leading to the adoption of certain initial postures that may influence the performance and influence how the agent is functionally integrated with the world. Affect is playing a role here, perhaps behind the scenes, but it's doing something in terms of introducing elements or aspects into body schematic processes. I think affect and body schematic processes are integrated, still part of this vertical mesh in expert performance. But I also think that they allow for an integration that attunes to targets in the environment. And that takes us into the horizontal features in the performative situation. And this is the fourth point, which is this idea that there's a horizontal axis involved. A horizontal axis that includes our relations with artifacts, instruments, established practices, as well as other people who may be in the environment or may be part of the performance. You can think of this, and people have thought of this, in terms of extended mind, the extended mind hypothesis, or in terms of distributed cognition, or Lambros Malaforis's notion of engagement theory. A number of people have been working on this, specifically with respect to performance in music and in acting and so forth. So the idea basically is that neither body schematic nor affective processes are isolated from the agent's environment. Rather, they are attuned to both stabilities and variations in environmental factors, including other agents in the environment. Simon Hofting, in his work on music, where he studied the Danish string quartet, uses an interesting term. He calls it an interkinesthetic affectivity, a kind of an attunement to the other person that is motoric and kinesthetic, but also affective. So there's a lot to talk about here. The ecological factors that are also normative in terms of involving cultural practices and the right way to do things, and also this intersubjective dimension. All of these aspects that are there in the physical and the social environment can form what Gibson and the ecological psychologists call affordances that are both physical and social, and these affordances will play a role in the way that the performance works out. So I think considering all these factors, we get an enriched meshed architecture that I think serves to frame a number of questions that can ultimately lead to a fuller explanation. So what I've been suggesting is that it's much more complex along both vertical and horizontal lines. But I think further explanation requires an account of the dynamical relations that exist among all of these elements, so that we start to think of the mesh more as a dynamical gestalt, a gestalt of processes in which eventually the vertical and the horizontal are really just explanatory abstractions. Perhaps the notion of these axes help us to organize our thinking about all of the different elements and how they kind of line up. But in fact, they don't simply line up. It's not simply a list of elements, but it's rather a set of factors that are dynamically interacting with one another in the performance. And trying to get to that is a difficult thing. Okay, I want now to take this concept of a meshed architecture into the realm of social cognition. And I don't want to think of social cognition in this kind of narrow sense of theory of mind, which really just centers on the notion of mind reading and develops a kind of methodological individualistic form of explanation where what we end up doing is we end up looking in the individual system, in the individual brain, in order to find the mechanism that explains how it is that we understand others. Rather, I take social cognition in a wider sense, where social cognition does not stay simply in the head, but involves embodied and situated processes understood in terms of intersubjective interaction that relies on direct and active perception of the intentions, the affective states of others, and social affordances that exist there with others in a shared world. This image on the bottom is Colwyn Trevarthen, who is a developmental psychologist at the University of Edinburgh, who's written quite a lot about things happening in early development from infancy onward. So he talks about primary intersubjectivity, secondary intersubjectivity, and we can also think about communicative and narrative practices that enter into our abilities to understand other people. Let me just say something briefly about some of these concepts. So some of you may be familiar with primary intersubjectivity. From birth onward, there are sensory, motor, and perceptual and affective processes that really drive interaction between infant and caregiver very early on in infancy. So we're really talking about basic embodied features such as posture, movement, facial expression, vocal intonation, gesture, vocalizations, back and forth types of movements between caregiver and infant. So this is what Trevarthen calls primary intersubjectivity, and a lot of our ability to understand the other person will depend upon these primary intersubjective factors. But these things are not just embodied in face-to-face interactions because they happen in a world. So secondary intersubjectivity, which starts at around 9 months of age, if not earlier, with joint attention, where say the infant and the adult are jointly attending to some artifact or something in the environment, a toy, for example. And joint action, where they can actually play together in what we might call pragmatic situations or play situations or simply intersubjective situations, where the shared environments and the artifacts mediate our understanding of others. We see what they're doing in the world, and that's helping us to understand what their intentions are, how they're feeling, and so forth. And those two kinds of intersubjectivity, I think, are very important and accomplish a lot. As one develops, of course, one gains the ability to use language. And so we can also start communicating linguistically with one another. And we also are able to form narrative. These kinds of processes, I think, can account for a more nuanced social understanding as we develop. Again, if you're interested in any of this stuff, I've been writing about it for a long time, and I have a recent book called Action and Interaction, where I go into great detail about these things. So my proposal here in this presentation is that if we take intersubjective interaction as a kind of performance, then we should be able to apply the model of a meshed architecture and see if that can help us explain how this works. And what I want to do is take a specific example of conversation analysis. Conversation analysis is the rich analysis of speech acts that not only express or communicate thought, but in some way constitute thought in the situation, in the performance situation where we're interacting with others. And the conversation that we're going to be looking at is really situated in affectively constrained circumstances that involve both embodied aspects like posture and movement and position, and ecological factors, environmental arrangements, affordances, other people, and so forth. So here I'm going to look at the work of Charles Goodwin, who does this. He's an anthropologist and does this kind of conversation analysis. And he gives a nice example in a paper in 2000, where he provides a detailed analysis of a dispute between two young girls, Carla and Diana, over a game of hopscotch. Hopscotch is this game, you know, where you have chalk drawings of a grid on the pavement, and you can hop and throw things down, hop and pick it up on one foot, and so forth. I'm sure you're familiar with something like that. What Goodwin does as an anthropologist is he goes out, he videotapes, and then he analyzes the videotape of the interaction between these two girls. It turns out that there's an interactive organization of various phenomena, different kinds of what he calls semiotic resources that have to be considered in order to understand the full encounter. This is a very simple encounter in some ways, but it turns out to be very complex in others. So for example, there is spoken language, I'm quoting him, spoken language builds signs within the stream of speech. Gestures use the body in a particular way, while posture and orientation use the body in another way. Goodwin emphasizes the visible public deployment of multiple semiotic fields that mutually elaborate each other. So these semiotic fields include a number of factors. First one is simply the temporal flow and the rhythm of high versus low, hard versus soft vocal intonation of the speech. And these different intonations can have a deontic rather than a descriptive force. They can clearly reflect various emotional, affective states of the participants. Another factor is bodily position. So one girl, for example, intentionally moves and stands in the way of the other girl in order to interrupt the game. There's a kind of embodied intersubjective interaction, something very much involving primary intersubjectivity in the context of the game, which is a context of secondary intersubjective joint action. A third factor, the bodily orientations of the two girls, allowing for eye contact and joint attention, specifically towards the hopscotch pattern on the ground. But also there are temporal modifications going on constantly in those postures. There's also ongoing reference to a completed action, throwing a marker on one of the squares. There's a set of instituted norms. The rules of the game of hopscotch are being paid attention to here. The situation is that Carla, one of the girls, is accusing the other, Diana, of cheating. So there's an appeal to the rules of the game that have been broken. And there are also other people looking on. So all of these factors start to create a very complex setting in which this conversation takes place. Also, hand gestures, which are, Goodwin says, dynamically integrated with the speech, but also are integrated with the body positions of both girls. So Goodwin says Carla has to use her body in a quite precise way while taking into account the visible body of her co-participant. She is faced with the task of using not only her talk, her speech, but also her body to structure the local environment such that her gestures can themselves count as forms of social action. Her gestures have to be presented and have to catch the attention of the other person. Unlike talk, gestures can't be heard. And this means Carla actively works to position her hand gestures so that they will be perceived by Diana. Carla's hand is explicitly positioned in Diana's line of sight, thrusting the gesturing hand towards Diana's face. And that at the same time twists Carla's body into a configuration in which her hand, arm, and upper torso are actually leaning in towards Diana. And all of this has significance. So how close is the gesture to the other girl's face? Well, that proximity has meaning. It might be expressing how upset Carla is in her accusation. And if it were not a gesture, but let's say a touch, how hard or soft and where the touch occurred would also have meaning. The gesture is meant to be attention grabbing, forcing the other to orient to the point being made in the speech or to a point of joint attention on something in the environment. And a grab could do the same sort of thing. The interaction, the conversation, is not confined to simply vocalization and gesture, because reference is made to the physical environment, glances to the hopscotch squares, which are under discussion. So we can start to think about this in terms of distributed cognition and material engagement. Also, this is not one-sided. The other girl is standing on one foot, attempting to finish her jump through the hopscotch squares, attempting to ignore the other girl, and of course, ignore the accusation of cheating. Joint attention in this whole conversation, joint attention is broken when one girl looks away. So the accomplishment of meaning involves two-way interaction and is not under the control of just one individual. And in another moment, Carla stomps her foot in a gesture that hits three semiotic points simultaneously. Where Diana happens to be looking, which is at the hopscotch square, which is in question. It's the one where the cheating occurred. And on the object that she is iterating in speech. Right? All of these things come together. The speech, the looking, and the position of the girls, and so forth. So what we have here is a complex integration of primary and secondary intersubjective capacities situated within a pragmatic social context, specifically of play. And these are both supplemented with and supporting the communicative process. Now, the idea here is that we want to try to map all of these rich details onto the model of a meshed architecture in order to gain a fuller and perhaps more organized picture of their dynamic integration in social interaction. So now the question is, can we use the meshed architecture to help make sense out of this? Well, one thing we can learn from Goodwin's analysis is that speech finds its way into the mesh, and specifically into the vertical integration of cognition or thought and motor control. As Austin put it, by saying something, we do something. All right? Speech acts, they are acts, they are actions. And Merleau-Ponty also talks about speech, and he says speech accomplishes thought. So thought is not something separate. It's not that we think something through in our head first and then simply express it, but rather in the expression, we are doing our thinking. We find our thoughts and so forth. So speech accomplishes thought, according to Merleau-Ponty. Thought then is accomplished in speech acts, but also in gestures and meaningful postures and movements. This thinking is constituted as it is communicated. All right. So we should get away from thinking about as something like thought as this separate realm that somehow or other reaches in, which comes from the top down into the bottom-up processes to control them. But rather, thought is in a certain way emerging from the processes that we're discussing. In the conversation, one might have strategic thoughts about what to say or how to put the accusation. But these thoughts really start to take shape within the particular circumstances of the communicative situation. They're motivated and modulated by each girl's affective state. Anger, a feeling of injustice may characterize both sides of this conversation, which may help to sharpen some of the facial expressions and gestures in a way that generates meaning. So affect is expressed, for example, in a smirk, a facial grimace, a look of exasperation, or just that way of being in your face as they get close to one another and gesture in a meaningful fashion. So Goodwin, in his analysis, is already exploring parts of the horizontal axis, the material and normative factors, the various semiotic resources that populate the environment, and the dynamical interactions that bring these things together and that situate the performance. So things like the artifacts, the marker that's thrown down, the hopscotch squares, the rules of the game, the other people in the environment, what some people describe as the affective atmosphere, not just affect in here, but the whole atmosphere of affect that surrounds this kind of confrontation, which may perhaps include the amusement or the discontent of the other players. Here is Hofstad's notion of the interkinesthetic affectivity that may be felt when others sort of take up sides with one girl or the other girl. All of this is complex and hard to grasp. I think for that reason, defining a meshed architecture is really only a first step. To explain the actual meshing of the very different types of variables that are involved, right? Things like words, gestures, artifacts, physical environments, normative elements. These are all very different and varied types of things. And to be able to try to describe how they mesh together, I think one can appeal to experiments that would test the dynamical integration of all of these factors using a method based on interventionist causality. That is to say, we can intervene on one aspect and see what happens with the other set of aspects or elements or factors. So we can map out relations that are perhaps enabling or constraining, or that involve a kind of reciprocal causality. And we can do this by intervening, by changing, adding, or subtracting one element in the system to see what happens with the other elements and with the organization as a whole. We might get improved communication, or we might get distorted communication, but we experimentally would have to test that out to see what exactly these different factors are adding to or subtracting from the process as it unfolds. I think we can get even more specific using dynamical systems models of coordination dynamics. Here I'm going to simply refer to a paper that has been published just as I'm speaking, just this week, and as I think you're hearing this, maybe 2 or 3 weeks before. This is a paper that is open access, so you can find it on the internet in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. It's by Scott Kelso and his group. The lead author is Emmanuel Tignoli, called Coordination Dynamics, a Foundation for Understanding Social Behavior. And in there, they go into great detail. They have their own dynamic systems modeling idea of how to go about doing this. And they point out what it can do, but also certain limitations of the method that they have not yet perfected. But it's a very timely paper for me in the sense that it really is pointing to precisely how one can get into the details to try to sort out how all these different kinds of factors can dynamically relate to each other, and in that way provide an explanation, the kind of explanation that we would be looking for. So this brings me then to my conclusion. I would say that if, in contrast to standard theories of social cognition that reflect intellectualistic conceptions of mind reading and methodological individualism, which reduces processes to mechanisms within the individual or the individual brain in order to explain this, things like mirror neurons or theory of mind modules or what have you. If in contrast to those kind of standard approaches, we pursue the idea that social cognition is a kind of performance, which would take us, I think, some distance away from mind reading and away from reducing it to a set of neural activations. It's certainly not to say that it doesn't involve the brain or neural activations, right? But it certainly involves much more than that, a much larger system that we have to try to understand. And if we pursue that idea, then I think we need an explanation of how embodiment, affect, social and communicative practices, ecological and normative factors all come to play a role in social cognition. And in that respect, I think we need a model, or perhaps even a complex set of models, that allows us to capture and organize all of the relevant factors. I think the notion of a mesh architecture is a good first step, helps us to kind of organize all of the different factors that might be involved. But then we also need to go beyond that to work out the dynamical relations among all those factors in order to get a full explanation or understanding of social cognition. Okay, thank you very much. I hope things were clear, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Let me sign off in that case, and I'll talk to you hopefully later.